When F1's other controversial early season driver change happened, Alpine F1 boss Flavio Briatore said he was only asking 3 things of Franco Colapinto. He needs to be fast, not crash, and score points. Red Bull may have got there first, dumping Liam Lawson after only 2 races, but Alpine was right behind and only gave its rookie Jack Doohan 6 races before bringing in Colapinto in the expectation he would be a clear upgrade. In the 3 races since though, Colapinto is 0 for 3 in meeting Briatore's demands, and this move so far is really not working out as planned. Like his predecessor, Colapinto hasn't scored a point, although he's had half the number of races to do so than Doohan did. Colapinto has shunted out of qualifying at Imola, spent a tricky first F1 weekend in Monaco off the pace, then looked slow again in Spain before a much needed improvement seemed to be on the cards in qualifying, only to miss his final Q1 run with a technical problem that Colapinto might have accidentally caused himself. Briatore is not one for being patient, but he was viewing the Spain weekend as Colapinto's first real event, given Imola was literally a crash course and Monaco, where Alpine was nowhere anyway, is a terrible place to go when unfamiliar with your car and slightly low on confidence after a qualifying crash. Unfortunately, Barcelona was irreversibly compromised by that qualifying problem as Colapinto was consigned to a 3rd race in a row spent stuck near the back of the field. This isn't a declaration that Colapinto is irredeemably bad, and it's not a demand for Doohan to be back in the car immediately, but Alpine said Colapinto had 5 races before a new evaluation ahead of the British Grand Prix at Silverstone in July. It means he's more than halfway into his supposed guaranteed time in the seat as Alpine works out what to do with its driver lineup long term. And by this point of his Williams cameo last year, which is a valid comparison given that was another mid-season switch into a car Colapinto had little knowledge of, Colapinto looked a much more convincing midfield asset. So a full triple header is at least enough to do an initial evaluation of how Colapinto is getting on against Briatore's own instructions, and so far the answer is underwhelming. Be fast. Colapinto didn't really show much of a spark during this triple header, certainly not in terms of results. He's averaging a 0.4 of a second deficit to Gasly in Q1, and by comparison, Doohan was only 0.126 slower than Gasly in their Q1 appearances, although the average grew to 0.271 when factoring in a heavy Q2 deficit in Bahrain. So Colapinto has been a step down from Doohan so far on 1-lap pace, and admits that getting more out of the car on low fuel is his main priority to improve. Colapinto's Q1 shunt at Imola helped him to technically get into Q2 there, but obviously he didn't take part. Then he was out in Q1 in Monaco and again at Barcelona, where he had got encouragingly close to Pierre Gasly in practice, but was still on a 3-run program in Q1 and needed to burn an extra set of softs. Colapinto's second run in Spain Q1 was reasonable and slightly faster than Gasly's first run when the track was slower. But he didn't get his 3rd run, which was a shame, as after getting his deficit down to just over 0.1 of a second in FP3, this looked like it might genuinely be a more competitive showing. And it was encouraging given Colapinto was missing the latest floor spec, which while not thought to be worth much lap time, was still a slight disadvantage. Grinding to a halt in the pit lane meant he didn't get his final lap in. That seemed unlucky, but Alpine hasn't actually said officially what the cause of the problem was, and we believe it was self-inflicted. Colapinto got caught out by the queue building after joining the fast lane to the point of half taking evasive action behind Gasly, which was accompanied by a horrible clunking audible from his onboard camera. Immediately the car lost drive, and all Colapinto trying to accelerate achieved was the creation of more nasty sounds. So it seems like the failure was simply caused by Colapinto not re-engaging the clutch in time, and it left him without the chance to show how much of a step had really been made since Friday, with FP3 and even what was visible in Q1 clearly Colapinto's best showing relative to Gasly since Imola FP3. Perception of Colapinto's speed hangs in the balance now going to the next 2 races in Canada and Austria. If FP3 and Q1 in Spain were indicative of real progress, making a real step in the next 2 events should be possible, and Colapinto will at least be on a par with what Doohan was showing. But if they were an outlier, or if Colapinto keeps starting weekends as far off as he has so far, then he's seriously at risk of not being fast enough to persevere with. Don't crash. Colapinto says he's lacking a bit of confidence with the car in some areas, as some corner entries he feels a bit uncomfortable and not able to carry the speed I need. That's not surprising given his lack of familiarity with the car, winter arrival in the team, and limited old car testing. He is on the back foot and has been placed in a difficult situation, but struggling to make an emphatic step could be tracked back to his Imola Q1 crash, which seemed to rob Colapinto of confidence early on. Shunting heavily at Imola immediately fell short of one of those key Briatore demands and was not the impression Colapinto wanted to make on his first weekend with his new team, especially as part of the reason Doohan was dropped is Briatore felt he made too many errors. And there is Colapinto's own career context to consider too, as the main downside to his generally impressive Williams part season in 2024 was that he had heavy crashes, 2 in Brazil in qualifying and the race, and in qualifying in Las Vegas. The Vegas one was the worst, not just because of the atrocious conditions in Brazil being a mitigating factor, but because Vegas was a result of poor judgment and risk management. And the accident at Imola was also a consequence of imprecision and a little overzealousness through the Tamburello chicane. It was a painful reminder of the risk and reward balance that needs to be struck in Q1 and what's at stake that early on in qualifying, especially as Colapinto seemed to immediately have the speed to get into Q2, having pieced together a strong first weekend up until that point. And he's not really made the same impact since. In Monaco he started miles adrift of Gasly, and even the inevitable step from Friday to Saturday left him 6 tenths away. As mentioned earlier, FP3 and Q1 in Spain were looking a good step better, but again Colapinto had left himself with a lot of work to do on Friday. It stands to reason that especially after Imola, Colapinto has been feeling his way into weekends more, and better to do that than keep crashing, which he's so far avoided repeating, and he has made it to the finish in all 3 races, so is at least doing better than Doohan was on that score. But eventually, it's not that much better if a too cautious approach just leaves Colapinto too far off to be competitive when it counts. Score points. When Doohan was dropped, a key part of the justification was how competitive the midfield is and how Alpine needed to maximise its best weekends. Doohan failed to score a point in his 6 attempts this season, plus his late call-up for last year's Abu Dhabi season finale. He came closest in Bahrain, where he ran solidly in the top 10 for most of the race until a tough final stint that was impacted by a safety car, without which points were likely. That was the only Grand Prix in Doohan's short 6-race stint that Gasly scored points for Alpine, although Gasly did grab a point in the Miami sprint race too, but it's not like Doohan was fumbling loads of opportunities. In that sense, Briatore put needless pressure on Colapinto by making points an important target for a team that's not scoring many already, especially as that's what every driver will be aiming to do anyway. But that's what Briatore did, and he cannot be happy to see just how far the second car has been from the top 10 in these last 3 races. Gasly should have been in the points at Imola, which was compromised by his own mistake and the team's strategy choice, but was a comfortable 8th in Spain. Colapinto has been an anonymous 16th, 13th and 15th in his races, hamstrung by his poor starting positions every time. It's been hard to judge his race pace as a result of that, but a generous conclusion is that if or when Colapinto qualifies better, his race results will get better too. We've already seen at Williams that he is capable of running really well in the midfield. What's unclear is how high his ceiling is, because right now it looks lower than what he managed at Williams, where he scored points in 2 of his first 4 starts and began life in F1 much more brightly. Whereas what Colapinto's doing now is neither what Alpine needs nor good enough to have dropped Doohan for. If Briatore was right about one thing, it's that the midfield is incredibly competitive. Teams like Sauber and Aston Martin, which started the season struggling, are now much improved and fighting for points. To hammer that home for Alpine, it slipped back to last in the championship after Spain, despite Gasly scoring points for only the 3rd time, and it will struggle to change that with only one car occasionally threatening the top 10. So what next? Theoretically, Alpine will reconsider Colapinto's position between the back-to-back races in Austria and Britain at the end of June and start of July. It may continue with him or decide to make a change, although one of the strangest parts of the narrative around Colapinto is that Briatore has talked as though his 5-race deal has been made up. He said on Colapinto's very first weekend in the car that "I read somewhere that he'll have 5 races, but no, there's no set limit on his races." Then in Spain claimed, "I never said 5 races." Well, for the record, Briatore signed off an Alpine press release ahead of the Imola weekend that was titled "BWT Alpine Formula 1 team announces that Franco Colapinto will drive alongside Pierre Gasly for the next 5 races." That same release said there would be a new evaluation before the British Grand Prix in July and quoted Briatore as saying, "Having reviewed the opening races of the season, we have come to the decision to put Franco in the car alongside Pierre for the next 5 races." So it's been handled slightly oddly, but what Briatore means is that Colapinto could race for more or less than 5 races subject to his performance. Less than 5 would frankly be very weird, but right now more than 5 would seem undeserved by the standards Briatore setting, although in our view 5 races isn't sensible at all, just like 6 for Doohan wasn't enough. Performance should be what matters, and as we've discussed, Colapinto's isn't where Alpine said it needed to be. Right now, it hasn't been worth dropping Doohan for this. Briatore has admitted that he doesn't know if Colapinto will stay in the car all season and has emphatically stated it depends on the performance. What we're looking for is just the performance, nothing else. That was presumably an indirect way of dismissing suggestions that Colapinto's solely in the car to tap into Latin American financial backing. If it's true though, then Colapinto's performance isn't convincing enough to be sure he will be retained. That could change over the next 2 events of course, and it relies on Colapinto making a clear step because he is a better driver than he's seen so far in this Alpine stint. The next race in Canada is a new track for him before a return to the more familiar territory of Austria's Red Bull Ring. Should Colapinto continue to underwhelm, then the situation gets interesting. Doohan is still in the picture as a reserve, as is another young driver, Paul Aron, who has tested older Alpines as part of his reserve role. Briatore reiterated this is all about getting the right drivers for 2026, so whatever experiment I need to do, I do it. There are also free agents like Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez to consider, with some early conversations being held with their representatives. But if gathering enough information to make an informed decision on next year really is the priority, then maybe the next move is to try Aron out rather than recall Doohan. Before it gets to that, it's fair for Colapinto to be given more time, and at least the 5 races that Briatore definitely didn't say he would have to begin with.